The surgeon who wouldn't look away. At 2:47 in the morning, a patient died on my operating table who should have walked out of that hospital alive, and when I pulled the chart to find out why, I discovered a number that had been changed by someone who knew exactly what he was doing. Within a week, the most powerful man in the hospital was trying to end my career. My name was on the local news, and I was starting to understand that some people would rather bury a truth, and the man who found it, than admit they'd been getting people killed for money. Before I tell you how I fought back and how I nearly lost everything, first do me one favor: subscribe to this channel, because stories like mine only get told when people like you refuse to let them disappear. My name is Dr. Elijah Carter. I'm a trauma surgeon, and for 11 years I ran nights in the emergency department of Ridgeline Memorial, the biggest hospital on the south side of Chicago. Trauma surgery is not a job you choose so much as one that chooses you. You have to be able to hold your hands perfectly steady while a 19-year-old bleeds out from a gunshot, make 6 decisions a minute with incomplete information, and then go home and sleep like it didn't happen so you can come back and do it again. Not everyone can. I could. I was, if I'm being plain about it, the best they had, and everyone in that building knew it, which is part of why what happened happened. I came up on the same streets my patients came from. My mother raised me in a 2-bedroom apartment 9 blocks from the hospital where I'd eventually work, and she worked 2 jobs so I could go to a school that would take me seriously, and she died the year before I finished my residency, so she never got to see me in the long white coat. I raised a child of my own, mostly alone after my wife passed. My son is grown now, a good man building his own life in another city, and I mention him only because being the parent who stays through every hard night teaches you a certain kind of stubbornness. You learn that showing up is the whole job. You learn to keep your eyes open when it would be so much easier to look away. That's what this story is about in the end, looking away and refusing to. Let me tell you one thing about the kind of doctor I was before any of this started, because it matters for what comes later. About a year before Marlon Ellis, I had a night where 3 separate shootings came in within 20 minutes. A bad night, even for the South Side, and I had a first-year resident named Priya Nair working with me. A brilliant, terrified young woman who'd never seen that much blood moving that fast. Halfway through the second case, she froze. Just locked up, hands trembling over an open abdomen, the way every good doctor freezes exactly once if they're lucky. And I didn't yell at her because somebody had once not yelled at me. I put my hand over hers and I said low so only she could hear it. You don't have to save the whole world tonight. You just have to do the next right thing. What's the next right thing? And she looked at the field and she said it out loud. And then she did it. And the patient lived. Priya Nair became one of the best young surgeons in that hospital, and she'll matter to this story later because the people you're decent to on the worst nights of their lives have a way of deciding who they are when your worst night comes. I tell you this so you understand that Ridgeline wasn't just a building where I worked. It was a place I'd poured myself into, a place full of people I'd bled beside, which is what made what happened next feel less like a betrayal by a man and more like a betrayal by a home. The patient's name was Marlon Ellis. 46 years old, a bus mechanic, came in after a car wreck on the Dan Ryan with internal bleeding and a fractured pelvis, serious but survivable. I'd operated on 100 cases worse than his and sent them home to their families. We got him stable in the OR. His numbers were good. And then in recovery, something went wrong that shouldn't have. And by 2:47 in the morning, Marlon Ellis was dead. And I was the one who had to walk out to the waiting room and tell his wife, who I will never forget as long as I live because she didn't scream. She just looked at me and asked me the one question I couldn't answer. What happened? I didn't know. And a surgeon who doesn't know why his patient died doesn't sleep until he finds out. So I pulled the record, and here's where it starts. Marlon had received a transfusion in recovery through a rapid infusion device, a machine that pumps blood into a bleeding patient faster than a bag on a pole ever could. Ridgeline had switched to a new model of that device about 8 months earlier, a product from a company called Meridian Medical. And I remembered the rollout because it had been a big deal, a lot of catered lunches and glossy folders, the chief of surgery personally championing the switch. When I looked at Marlon's chart, the device's flow rate had been logged, and I only caught it because I'd been staring at charts for 11 years and my eyes snag on things that don't fit. The log had been amended. A number changed 2 hours after the fact by an administrative login I didn't recognize. The changed number made the device look like it had performed normally. The original number, which I was able to recover because hospitals keep audit trails, whether people remember that or not, told a different story. The Meridian device had overinfused Marlon Ellis. It had pumped too much too fast and it had killed him, and someone had gone into the record afterward and quietly fixed the evidence. I sat in that empty records office at 4 in the morning and I felt the floor tilt. Because if it happened to Marlon, it had happened before. You don't change a number that smoothly the first time. That's the hand of somebody who's done it more than once. I did what I thought you were supposed to do. I took it to the chief of surgery. His name was Dr. Warren Prescott. He was 61, silver-templed, the kind of doctor who'd stopped being a doctor a long time ago and become something closer to a politician. A man whose name was on the wing they'd just built, who golfed with the board, who could end a career with a phone call and he'd hired me. He'd praised me at galas. And when I sat across from him and laid out what I'd found, the overinfusion, the altered log, the dead man, I watched his face do something I've thought about 1,000 times since. It didn't show surprise. That's the thing. A man who is hearing that his hospital's equipment killed a patient should be shocked. Warren Prescott was not shocked. He was calculating. He told me it was a tragedy. He told me the device was fine, industry-leading, that thousands of hospitals used it. He told me that the amended log was probably just a routine correction, that I was exhausted and grieving, and seeing patterns that weren't there, and that I should let the Mortality Review Committee handle it, the committee he chaired. And then gently he told me something that I didn't understand until later. He told me that I had a bright future here, Elijah, if you don't let a bad night derail it. I walked out of that office knowing two things. Warren Prescott already knew about the device, and Warren Prescott was not going to let me say so. I need you to understand how alone that made me feel, because it's the loneliest thing I've ever carried. When you find out the person in charge of protecting people is the one hurting them. The ground doesn't just move under you. It moves under everyone you might turn to, because who do you tell? The Mortality Committee was his. The head of quality assurance golfed with him. The hospital's own lawyers worked for the institution, which meant they worked in the end for the man whose name was on the new wing. I actually went home that night and stood in my kitchen and considered seriously whether I had imagined it, whether Prescott was right and I was just a grieving, exhausted man seeing shapes in the dark. That's the most insidious part of what men like him do. They don't just hide the truth, they make you doubt your own eyes for having seen it. The next morning, I went back to the records office to look at Marlon's audit trail one more time to be sure to prove to myself I wasn't crazy. And the record was gone. Not altered this time. Gone. The audit log itself, scrubbed less than 12 hours after I'd sat in Prescott's office and described exactly what it showed. That was the moment the doubt died. You don't erase a thing that isn't there. A man had reached into that system overnight and deleted the one piece of evidence I'd told him I had, and in doing so he'd told me more clearly than any confession that everything I feared was true. I just no longer had the proof. He'd taken it. And I understood that if I was going to fight this, I could never again show my hand before I was ready, because the moment he knew what I had, he'd make it disappear. What I didn't know yet was why. That took longer, and it took help, and the help came from the last person I expected. Her name was Hannah Doyle. She was a paramedic, one of the medics who'd brought Marlon Ellis in, actually, though I didn't put that together at first. She was in her mid-30s, red-haired, with the dry, unbothered toughness that people who scrape other people off the pavement for a living tend to have. She wasn't a doctor, and she didn't pretend to be, and she had exactly zero patience for people who thought that made her small. I'd worked alongside her for years in the loose way an ER doctor works alongside the medics who feed him patients. A nod at the ambulance bay, a shared cup of terrible coffee at 3 a.m. But I'd never really talked to her until the night she found me sitting alone on the loading dock, 2 days after Marlon died, staring at nothing. She sat down next to me without asking and handed me half of a sandwich, and she said, "You look like a man who found something he wishes he hadn't." And I don't know why, maybe because she wasn't part of the hospital hierarchy, wasn't somebody who could be threatened by Prescott. Or maybe just because she looked at me like a person instead of a problem. But I told her all of it, the number, the log, Prescott's face. And Hannah Doyle went quiet for a while, and then she said the thing that changed the whole story. She said, "Ellis isn't the first. I've been picking up bodies from this hospital's recovery ward that don't add up for about a year." I thought I was imagining it. Medics talk. We don't have charts, but we have eyes, and something's wrong in that building, and I've been too chicken to say it out loud, because who's going to believe a paramedic over a chief of surgery? She looked at me. But they might believe him and a paramedic, together. That was the beginning of it. And I want to be honest with you about the fear, because the fear was the realest character in this whole story. I had a career I'd bled for. I had my mother's whole sacrifice writing on the letters after my name, and I was being asked by a woman I barely knew to go up against a man who could erase all of it with a phone call over a truth that powerful people had already decided to bury. The safe thing, the smart thing by every measure the world uses, was to let the committee handle it, accept Prescott's warning as the gift it was dressed up to be, and keep my bright future. I thought about Marlon Ellis's wife, not screaming, just asking me what happened. I told Hannah I was in. I want to say something about Hannah here at the start before the fight swallows everything, because if I only show her to you as an ally, I'll have told the story wrong. She was not soft. The first time I tried to thank her in that earnest, over-careful way. People thank you when they think they're above you and are trying not to show it. She cut me off flat and said, "Don't do that. Don't do the doctor thing where you're grateful to the help. I'm not helping you. 9 people are dead, and I've been carrying it for a year, and now there's finally somebody who'll carry it with me. That's not a favor. That's the first full breath I've taken in months." And that reset something in me. In my whole career, I'd been the one people leaned on, the steady hands, the man who told the terrified resident to do the next right thing. I had forgotten, or maybe never learned, what it was to lean back on someone. Hannah Doyle did not want to be leaned on. She wanted to stand next to me, shoulder to shoulder, carrying the same weight. And there is a particular kind of falling that starts the moment you meet someone who refuses to look up at you or down at you and only ever across. The two of us started building it in the dark, in the spaces where powerful men don't bother to look. Hannah pulled her run reports. A paramedic keeps records too, and cross-referenced them against every recovery ward death she could remember over 18 months. I did the thing I could do, which was medicine. I quietly pulled charts when I could get to them, and I found the pattern Prescott had counted on nobody having the eyes to see. Over-infusions, flow rate logs that had been amended after the fact, always by the same handful of administrative logins, patients who'd come through survivable surgeries and died in recovery of complications that when you lined them up all wore the same face. It wasn't one dead man. Over 18 months, it was at least 9. And then we found the why, and the why was worse than I'd let myself imagine. Meridian Medical, the company that made the device, had a consulting arrangement with a small circle of physician advisors at Ridgeline, a board seat, a speaking contract, stock options that had become very valuable when Meridian's device got adopted by hospital systems across the Midwest, adoptions that Ridgeline's glowing outcomes data helped drive. And the physician at the center of that arrangement, the man whose name was on the consulting contract and the stock grant and the published outcome studies that told the rest of the country this device was safe, was Dr. Warren Prescott. He wasn't covering up a defect out of embarrassment. He was covering it up because every hospital that bought that device made him richer. And a device that killed people in recovery was a device that hospitals would stop buying, and dead men on the south side of Chicago were to Warren Prescott an accounting problem to be solved with a changed number. And the worst of it, the part that kept me up at night, was that he'd known. I went back and I remembered the rollout 8 months earlier, the catered lunches, the glossy folders, and I remembered that the biomedical technician had raised a concern about the device's flow calibration during the trial period and had been, everyone assumed, simply overruled. He hadn't been overruled. He'd been silenced. Prescott had gotten a warning about the exact flaw that would kill Marlon Ellis months before it killed him, and he had buried it because the money was better than the warning, and then he had spent those months watching patients die in recovery and quietly amending the numbers and standing at galas with his hand on the shoulders of the very people he was letting the device kill. That is not a man who made a mistake. That is a man who did the math and decided the deaths were an acceptable cost of the version of his life he wanted. Once I understood that, I understood that we were not in a disagreement between colleagues. We were in a war with a man who had killed by any honest measure and who would not stop at ruining a career to keep it hidden. He found out we were looking. Of course he did. Hospitals are small towns, and I had pulled charts, and someone told him. And Warren Prescott showed me then exactly how a powerful man fights. It started with a complaint. Suddenly, there was a formal allegation against me that I'd violated patient privacy by accessing records of patients who weren't mine. which technically on paper, stripped of all context, was true. I had pulled those charts. The fact that I'd pulled them to uncover 9 preventable deaths did not appear on the complaint. I was summoned before a committee, Prescott's committee, and suspended pending investigation, my access badge deactivated. Walked out of the building. I'd given 11 years of my life to, like a thief in front of nurses I'd worked beside for a decade. Then it got worse because Prescott understood that a suspended doctor is a wounded doctor, but a disgraced one is a dead one. A story appeared on a local news station, a Ridgeline trauma surgeon under investigation for serious violations, with a photo of me that somehow made me look like a mugshot, and unnamed hospital sources suggesting my recent cases were being reviewed for concerning outcomes. They were turning the dead patients against me. The very deaths I was trying to expose were being quietly repackaged as evidence that I was the dangerous one. It's an old trick, and it's a brilliant one. You take the man pointing at the fire, and you convince everyone he's the arsonist. The worst part wasn't the strangers who believed it. It was watching people who knew me start to hedge. Colleagues I'd worked beside for a decade stopped returning my calls. A surgeon I'd trained with a man I'd once covered a month of nights for when his father was dying crossed a hospital corridor to avoid me and couldn't meet my eyes. That's the quiet violence of what a powerful man does to you. He doesn't have to convince everyone you're guilty. He just has to make believing in you expensive, and then he waits. And one by one, he watches people decide they can't afford it. I don't entirely blame them. I've thought a lot about how many of them had their own families, their own careers, their own reasons to keep their heads down. But I learned in those weeks exactly who the few were that would stand in the fire with me, and it was not who I would have guessed. It wasn't the department chiefs or the men I'd golfed with. It was a night shift nurse named Gloria who'd worked recovery for 20 years and pulled me aside in a parking garage to whisper that she'd seen those deaths too and had a notebook, an actual paper notebook, where she'd written down everyone that didn't sit right because something in her gut had told her years ago to keep a record. Gloria's notebook, kept in secret out of nothing but a good nurse's stubborn conscience, became one of the quiet spines of the entire case. My hospital privileges were suspended at 2 other institutions where I had them, automatically the way a suspension cascades. I had malpractice insurers calling. I had a lawyer telling me the smart play was to settle quietly, apologize, take a censure, and try to salvage what I could. I sat in my apartment, 44 years old. Everything my mother had worked for turning to smoke, and I understood with total clarity that Warren Prescott was going to win because he had the hospital and the media and the machinery, and I had a stack of charts nobody would let me talk about, and a paramedic nobody would believe. Hannah came over that night. She found me at my kitchen table the way you find someone who stopped believing in the point of standing up, and she didn't give me a speech. She put a 6-pack on the table and she sat down and she said, "Okay, he's bigger than us, fine, so we stopped trying to win his way." And she laid out the thing that turned it around. We'd been trying to fight inside the hospital system, its committees, its reviews, its rules, and the hospital system belonged to Prescott. So we were going to go around it, to people who didn't answer to him. Hannah had a cousin who was a plaintiff's attorney, the kind of lawyer hospital administrators have nightmares about. And when we laid the whole thing out for her 9 deaths, the altered logs, the audit trails, the Meridian Consulting money, Prescott's stock, she got very quiet, and then she got very excited in the specific way of a person who has just been handed the case of their career. She explained that we had 2 roads and we were going to take both. The first was the FDA and the Department of Justice, because falsifying medical device data and defrauding a federal healthcare program are not hospital matters. They're federal crimes, and no chief of surgery, however connected, controls the FBI. The second was the families. 9 families who'd been told their loved ones died of complications and had never known there was anything else to know. There was a night in the middle of all of it, the worst stretch, when the break-in was fresh and the news story had just run, and I was closer to quitting than I ever told anyone, when Hannah drove me out to the lake at 2 in the morning because neither of us could sleep, and she said the city looked less like it was winning from out there. We sat on the hood of her beat-up car with the skyline across the black water, and she told me about her father, a firefighter who died going back into a building for a man who turned out to already be gone, and how she'd spent her whole life since being angry at him for it, and only recently understood that she'd become a paramedic to keep doing the exact thing she was angry at him for. "I run toward it," she said. "I don't know how not to. It's the only thing about myself I actually trust." and I looked at her in the dark. This woman who ran toward burning buildings, who'd looked at 9 dead strangers and refused to let them be forgotten, who'd sat down next to a stranger on a loading dock because he looked like he was carrying something too heavy, and I understood that I had spent my whole life keeping my hands steady so I wouldn't have to feel anything, and that she was the first thing in years that made me want to feel it anyway. I didn't say any of that. It wasn't the time. But I drove home as the sun came up, knowing that whatever happened with Prescott, I had already lost an argument with myself about Hannah Doyle, and I was glad to have lost it. Marlon Ellis's wife was the first person I went to see. I sat in her living room and I told her the truth I'd been suspended for finding. I told her that her husband should have lived, that a machine killed him, and that a man had changed a number to hide it. And she looked at me, the same look, the one that didn't scream, and she said, "I knew it. I knew he was too strong to just die like that. Thank you for not looking away." And she became, over the months that followed, the fiercest ally I had. Prescott did not sit still while we built it. When the first families started asking questions, when a widow he'd handed a complications line to 18 months ago suddenly had a lawyer requesting records, he understood that his careful little fire was catching wind, and he came at us harder. Hannah got called into her supervisor's office and told out of nowhere that there were concerns about her run reports, that maybe she was overextended, that maybe she should take some leave. Someone had reached across from the hospital to the ambulance service to squeeze her, and we both knew whose hand it was. The biomedical technician who'd kept his original report on the device got a call from a lawyer he'd never met, warning him about confidentiality obligations to Meridian. And one night my apartment was broken into nothing, taken no television, no laptop, even just my files gone through drawers, opened a clear and deliberate message left in the disorder: "We know what you're doing and we can reach you." I won't lie to you. That night I nearly folded. I sat on my floor with my papers scattered around me, and I thought about my son grown and safe in another city. And I thought about how easy it would be to just stop, to let Marlon Ellis be one more man the world had decided not to fight for. And then Priya Nair called me, my old resident, the one who'd frozen over an open abdomen and learned to do the next right thing. She'd heard I was suspended. She'd heard the whispers that I was dangerous, unstable, a good surgeon gone paranoid. And she called me to say she didn't believe a word of it, and that she'd seen things in that recovery ward too, and that whatever I needed she was in. "You told me once I only had to do the next right thing," she said. "This is mine." Having one person inside the building who still believed me, who could quietly confirm which logins matched which administrators, who could tell me when the committee was meeting and what they were saying, changed everything. Prescott had counted on isolating me. He forgot that I'd spent 11 years being decent to people on their worst nights. Here's what the powerful always underestimate: what happens when the people they've stepped on find each other. One grieving widow becomes 2, becomes 9 families in a lawyer's conference room, comparing the complications they'd each been told about, realizing they'd all been handed the same lie. Nurses who'd been afraid to speak, and there were several who'd seen those recovery deaths and been made to feel crazy exactly the way Hannah had started coming forward once they saw they weren't alone. A biomedical technician who'd flagged the device's overinfusion problem 18 months earlier and been transferred to a basement job for his trouble still had his original report. Every brick Prescott had counted on staying buried had a person attached to it, and people, unlike bricks, get tired of being sat on. Hannah's cousin, her name was Denise Okafor, and she turned out to be exactly the kind of relentless that this needed, pulled the whole thing into a shape the law could hold. She explained to us in that first long meeting that the reason cases like this almost never get made isn't that the crimes are hard to prove. It's that the victims are the kind of people the system is built to move past: quickly working people, Southside people, people whose families are told complications and don't have the money or the standing to demand a second sentence. They picked these patients on purpose, Denise said, and it landed in the room like a stone, not by name, but a device that overinfuses is going to do the most damage to the sickest, most complicated cases, the traumas, the bleeders, the ones nobody's going to look at twice when they die. They built a machine that hides its victims inside the exact population everybody's already decided not to grieve too hard for. That was the moment Marlon Ellis's widow stood up in that conference room and said she would testify, she would talk to any reporter, she would do whatever it took because her husband was not a complication, and she was done letting anyone treat him like one. Priya Nair did the quiet, dangerous work from inside matching administrative logins to the people who held them, confirming which corrections lined up with which deaths, feeding it all out to Denise through channels Prescott never thought to watch because it never occurred to him that a junior surgeon would risk her career for a suspended man. The biomedical technician handed over his 18-month-old report and his own paper trail of being ignored and then buried. And the federal investigators, once they had the image servers, found what data always gives up to anyone. Patient enough to read it. Not just the deaths, but the pattern of concealment, the consulting payments, the stock. The timeline that lined Prescott's growing wealth up beside a growing pile of amended charts like two graphs telling the same story. It stopped being my word against his. It became arithmetic, and arithmetic doesn't golf with the board. The federal investigation moved slower than I wanted and faster than Prescott expected. When the FBI and the FDA request 18 months of a hospital's device logs and audit trails, there is no phone call that makes that go away. And here is the beautiful, terrible thing about the altered logs. The alterations were the evidence. Prescott's great weapon. The smooth professional changing of numbers turned out to be a signed confession because every amendment carried a timestamp and a login, and the audit trail he'd assumed no one would ever pull laid out in cold data. Exactly who had gone into exactly which records at exactly what hour to make dead men look like accidents. He had spent months proving I was a criminal for reading the charts. He never stopped to worry about who had written in them. And the deleted audit log, the one Prescott had scrubbed the morning after I told him about it, the deletion I thought had cost me my only proof turned out to be the single most damning thing in the entire case. Because hospital servers back themselves up and federal investigators with a subpoena don't ask the hospital nicely. They image the whole system, backups and all. They recovered the deleted log. And then they had two things: the original data showing the device killed Marlon Ellis, and a record of a specific administrative login deleting that exact data at 6:14, the morning after the chief of surgery was told it existed. Prescott had tried to erase the evidence and had only added a second worse crime on top of the first time stamped and signed. The thing he did to protect himself convicted him. I have thought many times since about how often that's true, how the cover-up is the confession, how the powerful destroy themselves in the exact motion they think will save them. They arrested Warren Prescott on a Thursday, not in an alley, not quietly. The U.S. Attorney's Office does not do quiet when the charges are healthcare fraud, falsification of records, obstruction, and in the end counts tied to the deaths themselves. The same local news that had run my mugshot that wasn't ran his real one. Meridian Medical's device was pulled from the market. The consulting arrangement, the stock, the published studies that had sent that machine into hospitals across the country, all of it came apart in the light, and other hospitals started pulling their own charts and finding their own Marlins, and the thing Prescott had killed to keep small became a national reckoning. I testified at the trial, and I want to tell you about the one moment that gave me back something. Prescott had taken. His attorney tried to do to me on the stand what the hospital had done to me in the press. Paint me as a bitter, unstable man who'd invented a conspiracy because he couldn't handle a bad outcome. He asked me with practiced contempt whether it wasn't true that I'd been suspended for snooping in records that weren't mine, whether I wasn't just a rule breaker blaming the institution for my own failures. And I looked at the jury and then at Marlon Ellis's widow in the second row, and I said, yes, I broke a rule. I read the charts of patients who weren't mine, and I'd do it again tonight. Because a rule that stops me from finding out why a man died so that no one has to answer for killing him isn't a rule that protects patients. It protects the person who killed them. I took an oath. It wasn't to the hospital. It was to them. The room went very quiet, and for the first time since any of this began, I watched Warren Prescott look down at his own hands. My suspension was reversed. The privacy complaint, the one true on paper thing he'd had on me, evaporated the moment context was allowed into the room, because it turns out that accessing records to uncover 9 homicides is a defense that plays rather well once anyone's willing to listen. The hospital, desperate to be on the right side of a scandal, it had spent a year on the wrong side, of offered me my job back and my old title and a raise with a public apology. I said no. I took the settlement, the families, and I won instead. And I did the thing I'd wanted to do since the night my mother died before she could see my white coat. I opened a trauma clinic on the south side, 9 blocks from where I grew up in the neighborhood. My patients came from that answers to no board and no meridian and no man like Warren Prescott. Marlon Ellis's name is on the door. His widow sits on the board. We do not change numbers there. We look. We keep our eyes open. That's the whole job. Warren Prescott was convicted. At his sentencing, the family spoke, all 9 of them, one after another, reading the names the hospital had turned into complications, back into the record as men and women who had been loved. Marlon Ellis's widow read last. She didn't scream then either. She just told the court who her husband had been, the way he hummed when he fixed an engine, the plans they'd had, and then she looked at Prescott and said, "You changed a number. I want you to know his name was Marlon, and numbers don't have widows, and men do." I have been in a lot of rooms where terrible things happened, and I have never heard one go as quiet as that one did. He is not a chief of surgery anymore. He is not a doctor anymore. The medical board stripped his license the same month, and he is not a free man and will not be for a long time. When I think about him now, which is rarely, I think that he had everything the world tells you to want, and he traded 9 human lives for a little more of it, and in the end the numbers he was so good at were the very thing that counted him out. Now I've told you the fight. Let me tell you the part I actually carry. Hannah Doyle and I never once in all those months talked about what was growing between us. There wasn't room. You don't fall in love while you're bailing water out of a sinking boat. You just notice later that you kept reaching for the same person's hand in the dark. But somewhere in it, the loading dock sandwiches, the 6-packs at my kitchen table on the nights I wanted to quit the drives to see families who'd lost everything. I stopped being a man who happened to be fighting alongside her and became a man who could not imagine the fight or much of anything else without her. She was the toughest person I'd ever met and the kindest, and she'd stood next to me when standing next to me could have cost her her own job. And she never once made me feel like she was doing me a favor. The night the clinic opened after everyone had gone home, Hannah and I stood in the empty waiting room under the new sign, and I finally said the thing I'd been too busy surviving to say. I told her that I'd spent 11 years being the best trauma surgeon in the building, and I hadn't understood the first thing about my own life until a paramedic sat down next to me on a loading dock and refused to let me look away. Not from the truth, and not it turned out from her. And Hannah Doyle, who is not a woman who cries, got something in her eye that she'd deny to this day, and she said, "Took you long enough, doctor." And then she kissed me in the empty waiting room under Marlon Ellis's name, and 11 years of holding my hand steady while the world came apart. Finally, for once gave way to something that wasn't an emergency at all. She works out of the clinic now, running the paramedic training program we started for kids from the neighborhood who want a way into medicine that doesn't require the kind of money nobody around here has. Priya Nair moved with me. She left Ridgeline the day my resignation posted and never looked back, and she runs the surgical side. Now, teaching young residents the same thing I once taught her, that you only ever have to do the next right thing. Denise Okafor sits on our board next to Marlon Ellis's widow. We built the whole thing out of the wreckage of what a greedy man tried to bury, which is the part I like best. Everything good in my life now grew directly out of the ground he tried to salt. We built it together the way we built everything else, the tough one and the stubborn one, the medic and the surgeon side by side. Some nights we still can't sleep, both of us wired from too many years of 3 a.m., and we sit up on the back steps and talk about the ones we saved and the ones we couldn't. And Hannah leans her head on my shoulder, and I think about my mother who worked 2 jobs and taught me that showing up is the whole job, and died before she could see my white coat. I think she'd have liked Hannah. I think she'd have taken one look and said, "That's a woman who stays." She'd have been right. Hannah Doyle ran toward the fire her whole life, and one night she ran toward mine and she never left. They wanted me to look away. A man with everything I didn't have was certain I would, because almost everyone does. He'd built his whole life on the safe bet that the people around him would choose comfort over conscience, and for a long time it had been a good bet. But my mother worked 2 jobs so I could learn to keep my eyes open, and a paramedic sat down next to me on a loading dock and reminded me why it matters, and a nurse kept a secret notebook out of pure, stubborn decency, and a young surgeon risked her whole career to do the next right thing, and 9 families refused to let their dead be called complications. The powerful count on us being alone. Our whole strength is that we don't have to be. The truth. Once it finds the right stubborn people and lets them find each other, is the one thing all the money in the world can't kill. If this story moved you, you know what to do. Subscribe and tell me in the comments. Have you ever had to choose between the safe thing and the right thing? I read every single one. And stick around, the next story I've got for you starts with a phone call nobody was supposed to answer, and it goes places you won't see coming.